大家好，欢迎来到读中生智第12周 To mitigate or to adapt action on climate change 减缓或适应气候变迁行动大哉问。我是 Hsin-Chieh Lin 林心杰，写作教学中心的老师。这周我们要来阅读一些讨论面对气候变迁时人们的认知与思考方向的文章。或许提到气候变迁，大家会觉得是一个有点老掉牙的议题。但是如果我们已经很了解气候变迁，为什么看起来问题还是没有明显的改善呢？如果人们的认知会影响我们的行为，我们不妨来看看究竟人们对于气候变迁的认知是什么样的。我们可以用什么观点来思考、讨论气候变迁的议题，好促使我们采取更正确的行动呢？透过本周的阅读，我们希望能够跟大家一起探索与分析气候变化相关的议题。首先，我们要用对气候变化主题的先辈知识，判断一些陈述究竟是事实或者是观点。接着要判断文章主旨，并了解支持性的细节。使用批判阅读技巧，从精选的文章中收集有关气候变化的事实。最后要整合信息和想法来表达自己的意见。现在我们来小小的暖身一下，请大家思考一下全球正面对最严重的议题有哪些，其中最巨大的威胁是哪一个？对于这些全球性的危机，我们可以做些什么呢？请各位写在一张空白的纸上来当作暖身。现在我们一起来讨论看看，你写下什么危机呢？是核子战争、恐怖主义、网络攻击、假新闻，还是我们今天要讨论的全球气候变迁呢？这些都是非常重要的议题。其中全球气候变迁有个特色，就是在短时间的影响来看，它并不如其他的议题那么戏剧化或者是有新闻性。但是联合国把气候变迁列举为全世界面对最重大的危机之一，因为气候变迁实际上影响了我们生活的各个层面。2019年世界经济论坛撰文提到，根据皮尤研究中心在26个国家做的研究显示，气候变迁是最大的国际威胁。这份研究记录了气候变化的物理迹象，例如陆地和海洋的温度上升、海平面加速上升、冰山融化，这些对社会经济发展、人类健康、粮食安全都造成威胁，许多人被迫迁移并流离失所。同时在陆地和海洋的生态系统也引发了一连串的连锁反应。2020年3月，联合国新闻 UN News 也提到，联合国气候报告显示，气候变迁正在对环境和各个方面以及全球人口的健康和福祉产生重大的影响。USA Today 也提到，地球在应对气候变化方面偏离了轨道。专家们还宣布，气候变化比冠状病毒造成的威胁要大得多了。气候变迁无疑是个严重的问题，但在面对这个严重的议题时，我们先回头来想想，我们已经知道些什么？我们想知道些什么？我们已经采取了哪些行动呢？同样的，请各位花一点时间，把以上这些问题的答案写下来。接下来请各位看一个短片，在投影片上是 WMO 世界气象组织2019年的气候状况报告。看完这个短片，我们来判断一下这些陈述是事实或者是意见呢？ Fact or opinion？ 第一个陈述，气候科学家和专家一致认为，使用石化燃料会造成全球暖化。没错，这是一个客观的陈述 fact。可能有些同学会觉得，似乎 agree 这个字是在表达一种意见，但事实上这句话是在陈述专家的看法，并非说话者自己的判断，算是一种报道，而且目前也有许多的论证可以支持这个论点，所以可以算是一个客观的陈述。2，在过去1个世纪中，由于海洋变暖和冰川融化，海平面上升使沿海的风暴更具破坏性。没错，这也是一个事实 fact， 可以说这是一种对环境的观察。第3， 如果个人不采取措施来减少石化燃料的消耗，阻止气候变迁，文明就可能会崩溃。这是一个事实，或者是个人意见呢？没错，这是一个个人的意见判断。但是这个意见如果有适当的事实来支持，可以成为一个论点。第四，全球天然气盛产可能可以解决气候变迁，因为它减少了对煤炭的依赖。煤炭是更具破坏性的污染物。我们可以理解到这是一个意见，是一个个人的判断。第五，由气候变迁所造成的极端天气和相关的灾害可能损害经济，并且让社会群体之间的不平等更加剧烈。这些因素可能会增加武装冲突的发生风险，例如水和粮食战争。这是意见或是事实呢？这个陈述是一个个人的判断，认为这样的事情可能会发生，但是可以被讨论。第六，科学家可能会犯错，是事实还是意见呢？这是一个事实。虽然我们看到有 wrong 这个字，好像是个判断，但是这个陈述说科学家可能会犯错。只要有一个科学家犯错，就可以证实这句陈述的真伪。既然可以证实，就是事实。现在让我们来阅读第一篇文章。欧洲的人民是否了解气候变迁对海洋造成的影响？请各位同学花5分钟的时间来阅读。
Does the European public understand the impacts of climate change on the ocean? The first in-depth study of the European public's awareness of the impacts of climate change on the ocean shows that although most are relatively well-informed, an alarming number remained uninformed and even misinformed. An opinion poll of 10,000 citizens in 10 European countries published in Frontier in Marine Science shows that many believe the Arctic sea ice is already completely lost during the summer and that sea temperatures have already risen by more than 2 degrees Celsius. A major shift in the way climate science is communicated to the public is needed to incentivize citizens to demand action to prevent the impacts of climate change. The oceans are our lifeline and the lungs of our planet, producing 70% of the oxygen we breathe. They regulate our climate and provide us with food, new medicines, and energy. However, the ocean, and therefore the future of humanity, is threatened by climate change. But how much does the public really understand the impacts of climate change, and what can be done to facilitate better communication between scientists, the media, government, NGOs, and the public? The opinion poll of 10,000 citizens is the first in-depth study looking at public engagement with marine climate change issues across 10 European countries. Although most of the European population is relatively informed about marine climate change issues, a surprising numbers are poorly informed and even misinformed, revealing a major failure at communicating climate change science to the public, explained Professor Carlos Durate, co-author on the paper and director of the Red Sea Research Center in Saudi Arabia. 54% of European citizens believe that human plays only a partial role or no role in climate change. Many who thought that they were well informed on the impact of climate change on the ocean believe scenarios that may happen by 2100 if we do not reduce greenhouse gas emission have already occurred. For example, loss of Arctic sea ice in the summer. This accounts for 26% of respondents, and sea temperature increases of more than 2 degrees Celsius. This accounts for 30% of respondents. This is hugely disturbing because if these changes have already occurred in their minds, what incentive do these citizens have to demand actions to prevent such changes, says Durate. The European public perceive ocean pollution as the most severe human impact on the ocean. However, they are not well informed on ocean acidification caused by carbon dioxide emissions, melting sea ice, coastal flooding, sea level rise, and extreme weather events were also of concern. Interestingly, nations that have already been coping with problems such as the Dutch, with sea level rise and the Norwegians with sea ice loss are the least concerned with the impact of climate change. Citizens declare very little trust in government institutions and their scientists and have the most trust in scientists employed by university. Lead author Paul Buckley from the Center for Environment, Fishery, and Aquaculture Science in the United Kingdom explains. The study shows that we don't all engage with issues around climate change impacts on the coast and sea in the same way. Awareness and levels of concern are generally higher for people living closest to the sea, women, Southern Europeans, and increase with age. We need to tailor our message given the differences in how audiences across Europe engage with these issues. Making issues that seem remote from people's everyday life relevant is certainly a challenge. We are at a time when decisions made will have irreversible consequences, and this level of misinformation is a huge vulnerability for society in general and for future generations, says Durrett. The survey calls for a major shift in ways we communicate climate change with far less emphasis on what changes may occur in the future, as these can be misinterpreted by the public, and we need a greater involvement of university scientists.
现在，请各位同学阅读以下的陈述，并且根据刚刚的阅读，判断这些陈述是否正确。没错，我们会发现 A 跟 D 是正确的。读完本篇文章，我们会发现文章的目的是提供调查的资讯，让我们知道欧洲大众对气候的变迁不完全理解，甚至只有在气候变迁真正影响到他们的生活的时候才比较有感觉，例如住在海岸边的居民。也因此，作者认为在进行相关政策的沟通的时候，应该更着重在连结议题与大众生活。B 选项可能会让人有些困惑，因为第3段的第一句似乎提到说，许多的欧洲大众对于气候变迁普遍都有一定的意识，但是你仔细看看 B 选项，会发现 B 选项是针对海洋酸化，所以并不正确哦。选项 C 则是在第4段里提到的现象之一，海洋温度上升2度不是已经发生的事，而是在2100年可能会发生的事。只是调查发现，许多人误以为这件事情已经发生了。确认过理解之后，我们来详细阅读一下。各位同学觉得第1段主要想表达的主旨是什么？又有哪些支持性细节呢？我们可以看到，第1段首先介绍了文章想要表达的主旨，也就是欧洲大众对于气候变迁给海洋带来的影响有多少了解。其中第1句的后半段提到，还是有许多人不了解甚至误解这个议题，所以文章才提出应该改变沟通的方式，才能提供大家诱因做出正确的行动。接着在第2段的后半，作者提出了一个问题，是关于大众究竟多了解气候变迁，如何促进科学家、媒体、政府、非营利组织与大众之间的沟通。请问针对这样的问题，作者给出什么样的答案呢？在第3段，作者就揭晓了谜底。1万个受试者参与了这次的调查，从中研究者发现许多人不甚了解或者是误解相关的议题。接着在第4和第5段的内容，则进一步说明究竟大众有哪些的误解，并且这样的误解会显示出我们在沟通方面发生了什么样的问题。调查发现，许多人以为一些还没有发生的灾难已经发生了，而科学家发现，这样的误解会让民众失去采取预防措施的动力。现在我们也来看看，从以下的文章中可以合理推断出哪些事实呢？没错，我们可以推断出2，女性对于相关议题比较有意识，这在第7段中有提到，以及第4个选项，如果我们着重在气候变迁对未来的影响，可能会让大众误解或取得错误资讯。这是整篇的最后一句内容所提到的。最后，我们来看看本篇的结论。结论提到，在沟通的过程中， 应该更多与大学里的科学家，也就是研究人员或者是教授合作。这是什么原因呢？第6段提到一个有趣的现象，就是大众普遍似乎对于政府的科学家没有什么信心，而比较相信大学里的研究人员。正是这个研究，让文章在最后提出，往后的议题沟通应该要让大学人员更多的参与。接下来我们要读第2篇文章，是从道德的角度来劝大家采取行动，延缓气候变迁。这篇文章的原文比较长，但是并不难读，我们只截录了其中几段放在影片上，同学们也可以直接在网络上阅读全文。
An excerpt from 3.3 Environmental Ethics, Climate Change by Jonathan Spellman. The problem of climate change. While abrupt climate change is definitely a problem, it is not necessarily a moral problem. Abrupt, anthropogenic, i.e. human-caused climate change, however, is a moral problem. To see this, consider the differences between a scenario in which a forest fire burns your neighbor's house down and a second scenario in which you burn your neighbor's house down. In the first scenario, when the forest fire burns your neighbor's house down, something bad has happened, but no one is morally responsible for that bad thing. No one has done anything morally wrong. In the second scenario, however, when you burn your neighbor's house down, not only has something bad happened, but someone is morally responsible for that bad thing. Is there abrupt anthropogenic climate change? Yes, there is. When human takes fossil fuel, for example, coal, oil, and natural gas, out of the ground and burn them to heat their homes, power their cars, and charge their electronics, they must emit greenhouse gases, most notable carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. The GHG particles absorb and emit radiant energy, which causes global warming, i.e. an increase in the Earth's average surface temperature, and other climate changes, for example, altered precipitation patterns that increase the number of extreme weather events. Although some people deny this, it is relatively uncontroversial. What is controversial, however, is the question of what you and I are morally required to do in response to about abrupt anthropogenic climate changes, hereafter simply climate change. Environmental ethicists generally agree that you and I are morally obligated to do something in response to climate change, but they disagree about what that is. In the following section, I will argue that you and I are morally obligated to do 3 things in response to climate change. First, we must reduce our GHG emissions. Second, we must offset our remaining GHG emissions if we can afford to. And third, we must advocate for climate-friendly policies and politicians. Why? Because failing to do these things is irresponsible. Returning to the scenario in which you burn your neighbor's house down. In that scenario, you clearly harm to your neighbor. Even if you don't physically harm her, you destroy her property. You force her to find a new place to live. Climate change has similar effect. Between increasing the severity of droughts and flood and by causing sea level to rise, climate change is killing and will continue to kill humans and non-human animals. Others are being forced to abandon their home and find new places to live. For many humans, this will be much more difficult than simply finding a new home to buy. It will require abandoning one's homeland and moving somewhere completely foreign. For non-human animals, it will be even more difficult. Some species, like polar bears, for example, may find it impossible to adapt and will go extinct. Now, when you burn down your neighbor's house, you endanger your neighbor and force her to find a new place to live. This is clearly wrong. But when you contribute to climate change, do you endanger anyone? Do you force anyone to find a new place to live? It is not clear that you do. Notice that the harms of climate change are cumulative harms. Your contribution to the problem is relatively insignificant. This leads some to argue that when you contribute to climate change, you do not do anything morally wrong. While it may be true that your contribution to climate change is relatively insignificant, it is worth noting that how much you contribute to climate change varies significantly depending on where and how you live. Those living in Australia, Canada, and the United States, for example, emit much more carbon dioxide per capita than those living in India, Indonesia, and Brazil. This on its own may be a reason to think that you are doing something morally wrong since you are contributing more than your fair share to climate change. Regardless, I want to argue that even if your contribution to the problem of climate change is relatively insignificant, it is still wrong. To see this, let's return to the hypothetical scenario we've been discussing. The scenario in which you burn your neighbor's house down. This time, however, let's assume that you don't actually burn your neighbor's house down. Instead, you created a trail of dry brush from a nearby forest to your neighbor's house. This on its own doesn't harm your neighbors in the least. It does, however, make it more likely that your neighbor's house will burn down. This is especially bad if there are frequent forest fires. But even if there aren't frequent forest fires, it is still morally wrong for you to endanger your neighbor and her home for no good reason. It is irresponsible. When we contribute to climate change, we do something analogous. We don't necessarily force anyone to find a new place to live, but we do increase the likelihood that people across the globe will have to find new places to live. This is morally wrong, especially when our reasons for contributing to climate change aren't good ones. If, for example, you start your car engine before getting into your car so that it has time to warm up, you're doing something morally wrong. Why? Because you're increasing the likelihood that human and non-human animals across the globe will have to find new places to live, and you're doing it for no good reason. Sure, it's nice to warm up your car before getting into it, but that isn't a sufficiently good reason to justify your endangering both human and non-human animals. Some reasons, however, are sufficiently good to justify your endangering both human and non-human animals. When it is very cold outside, for example, it is morally permissible to heat your home so that your pipes don't freeze. But when your salary doesn't permit you to live close to your workplace and you can't carpool or use public transportation to get there, it is morally permissible for you to drive to work. It's true that in driving, you will emit some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It is also true that this makes it slightly more likely that sentient beings will have to find new places to live, but you are not acting irresponsibly. Similarly, when you light a candle in your home, it increases the likelihood that your neighbor's house will burn down. But it doesn't follow from this that it is always wrong to light a candle in your home. Is this the full story? Not quite, and here's why. Imagine that you got a sufficiently good reason to light a candle. You realize that this increases the likelihood not only that your house will burn down, but also that your neighbor's house will burn down. Now imagine that there is some small things you could do to reduce the likelihood of your neighbor's house burning down. You could install a smoke alarm, for instance. It seems like you are morally obligated to do this. Note that you are not morally obligated to do this for your own sake. There's nothing necessarily wrong with burning yourself or destroying your house. I certainly don't recommend doing either of those things, but they are not necessarily morally wrong. The reason then that you are morally obligated to install a smoke alarm is not to protect yourself, but to protect your neighbor. If your candle were to start a fire, your smoke alarm will alert you to the danger, and you could call on the fire department to put out the fire before it destroys your neighbor's house. Failing to install a smoke alarm will be irresponsible. This becomes increasingly true as the number of people living close to you increases. If you're surrounded by homes, or if you live in an apartment and are surrounded by neighboring families with children and pets. Lighting a candle without having a smoke alarm is especially irresponsible. When we contribute to climate change, we're doing something analogous. We're increasing the likelihood that humans and non-human animals will die or be forced to find new places to live. Fortunately, there's something we can do to reduce the likelihood of this. We could offset our GHG emissions, hereafter simply emissions. When we purchase carbon offsets, we fund projects that reduce emissions by funding the development of wind farms, enabling landfills to capture emissions, and/or preventing deforestation. When we offset enough of our emissions, we go carbon neutral, which is to say that our net emission, i.e., our emissions minus our offsets, equals zero. By offsetting our emissions, we make it the case that no human or non-human animal is more likely to die or lose her home on our account. When we offset our emissions, we act responsibly. This is what morality requires. Finally, imagine that you're living in an apartment and are surrounded by neighboring families. You light candles from time to time, but you have installed a smoke alarm and a sprinkler system. You do not significantly increase the likelihood that others will lose their homes. The same, however, cannot be said of your neighbors. They light candles all the time, but don't have smoke alarms or sprinkler systems. They're endangering all the people and non-human animals living in the apartment complex, but they don't see the problem. You would move to a new apartment complex, but let's assume that you are stuck in this one. It seems to me that in a case like this, a responsible person would not simply cross his finger and hope for the best. He would try to convince his neighbors to stop lighting candles all the time. He would encourage the manager of the apartment complex to add smoke alarms and sprinkler systems to every unit. He would petition the local governments to require these things in apartment buildings and vote for candidates who support these policies. He would advocate for change.
如同前面所说，文章本身并不困难，所以让我们直接进入批判思考的问题吧。首先，我们来谈谈气候变迁的个人责任。这篇的作者主张，除非我们有正当的理由，否则做出气候变迁恶化的行为都是不道德 （morally wrong） 的。那么，请各位想想，平时我们有哪些行为可能会造成气候变迁的恶化？我们在做这些行为的时候，有没有什么好理由非得做不可呢？或者是其实我们没有真的有好理由呢？接着，本篇作者也提到政策的重要性，我们也一起来想想，有哪些活动可以支持提倡气候保护政策？例如地球日、大众运输日吗？还有这些活动有哪些是道德上必要，哪些又是无关乎道德的呢？好的，我们已经阅读了2篇从不同观点探讨气候变迁的文章。第一篇关心的是人们对气候变迁的认知状况，以及如何敦促人们采取行动。第二篇则诉诸道德，指出人们必须将改变气候变迁视为一种道德责任。现在，请同学听一段联合国秘书长呼吁人们采取行动的演说。看完了影片，我们试着来整合这3个篇章的资讯。请同学们先看看荧幕上的这个表格，左边列出阅读1、阅读2以及影片。这3个篇章都有一些共通的主题，我们列出3个。第一个是采取气候变迁时人们所需要的动机。第二是篇章本身关注的气候变迁的种类。最后一个则是篇章本身用来说服读者或听众的角度。请各位同学先试试看完成这个表格。在同学写完之后，一起来讨论看看。首先我们来看看各个篇章认为什么样的动机可以鼓励读者或听众采取行动呢？文章1首先提出，大众对于气候变迁有误解之处，因此主张要改变沟通方式，让气候变迁的议题更贴近生活，才会让大家有动机。文章2 则主张道德与公民责任就应该是我们的动机。影片则提出，目前我们的行动仍然不足，危机还是非常严重，来敦促我们采取行动。各篇章所关注的气候变迁类型也不太一样。第一篇着重于海洋的变化，第二篇主要谈的是人为造成的各种气候变迁危机，而影片则是广泛的讨论各种变迁。最后一个主题是这些篇章采取什么角度来说服读者呢？第一篇文章比较接近学术论文，所以采用的主要是说理，提供理性的推论来说服读者。第二篇除了说理，我们也可以看到作者努力与读者建立共同的价值观，也就是要把气候变迁当作一种道德责任。这种诉诸共同价值观的方法，可以加深读者对作者与篇章的信任。影片则主要透过激励性的语言和画面，挑动观众的情感，用感性的方式达到敦促行动的目的。读完了本周阅读，我们可能更加理解气候变迁，但更重要的是，我们看见了有许多讨论气候变迁时不同的切入角度和说服的方法。我们能不能想一想，有些什么好方法可以用来说服你身边的家人、朋友，采取一些能帮助减缓气候变迁的行动吗？今天很高兴能跟大家一起看看，我们可以用什么角度来审视、讨论气候变迁。我们练习了如何辨认事实与意见，指认了文章的主旨和支持性细节，试着做推论，也整合了不同篇章的信息。大家不妨也可以去看看有哪些不流于俗的角度可以来讨论气候变迁哦。祝大家阅读愉快！